Hey BookTube friends, it's Carrie. Thanks for joining me. I thought I would check in and talk about the 2 books that I've listened to over the past week and a half. I've only been able to fit in 2 audiobooks because I am reading a physical book and I'm pretty invested in it. It is Chimes of a Lost Cathedral by Janet Fitch, and this is the sequel to The Revolution of Marina M. I'm about a third of the way through this one, but because I'm so invested in this title, it's been a little difficult to fit in a lot of other reading. So I do have 2 books to talk about. The first one is David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants by Malcolm Gladwell. And I would consider this book sort of like a sociological discussion. It's the second Malcolm Gladwell book that I've read. The first one I really enjoyed. It was called Talking to Strangers, and I will link that book review that I did in either the description or the cards. But that book I felt like was very timely because of how divisive and polarized we are right now. And that book I would recommend. This book wasn't very gripping for me. It wasn't groundbreaking. Essentially, the premise is that ordinary people can successfully tackle insurmountable odds. I do believe that sometimes our disadvantages, or what other people see as disabilities, can lead us to develop very valuable skill sets and can also cause us to be more resilient. And I do think resiliency is a characteristic that is undervalued. I think a lot of our young people don't have as much resilience as maybe they should. And so I think we have to work extra hard to try to cultivate that in people. So there wasn't a whole lot in this book that surprised me. Some of the anecdotal evidence he included were stories about people who have dyslexia and the challenges that they faced and how they've coped with that, and strategies that they have accumulated over time that have really worked out well for them in certain circumstances. And then also being raised in a poor environment versus being raised in a wealthy environment, and how being raised in a poor environment actually does cultivate a lot of skills that successful people need. And so a lot of successful people started out in an economically disadvantaged situation. None of this was necessarily new. He didn't provide a lot of research or data. A lot of the information was anecdotal. And the anecdotal information was not necessarily very good. I like qualitative sort of studies, and I like those stories, but this one just kind of missed the mark for me. And I don't know if maybe it's because I'm in education. I'm also wired to look for those unconventional strengths that maybe some of our students have, and trying to kind of maximize those to make sure that they're successful. I don't know if that background affected my viewpoint of this book, but it wasn't anything I didn't know. It wasn't groundbreaking. There were no actionable strategies in this book, so I don't really think I would recommend it. I think that most of what was said in this book could have been accomplished in a 10-minute TED Talk. So the next book that I listened to was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. And just a warning, this book, if you haven't heard of it, it is very dark. It deals with some very delicate, very traumatic subject matter. It does deal with sexual abuse. And I will say, considering the subject, this author did a phenomenal job of maintaining a balance. When you write about that sort of subject matter, you really are walking a tightrope, I think, because you don't want to do a disservice to people who have suffered this sort of abuse, and you want to make sure that it is an authentic story, even if it is fiction. Again, I don't think it's the burden of fiction to right all wrongs and, create justice where there needs to be justice. I don't think that's fiction's job, but I do think it's fiction's job to make us think and make us feel and tell important stories. And I believe that this book does that. We follow a 15-year-old named Vanessa Y as she goes to attend a very prestigious boarding school. And there are two timelines in this, the 15-year-old timeline and then the timeline where Vanessa is an adult. We follow her into her 20s and then also into her 30s as she is dealing with the aftermath of what has happened to her at this boarding school. While at boarding school, her English teacher, Mr. Strain, takes a particular interest in her, and we see the step-by-step process of Mr. Strain grooming Vanessa for this abuse. And I will say this book is very vivid and graphic in its depiction of Mr. Strain's grooming and then abuse of Vanessa. But I do think it's important to show that, because I think there's a misconception that abuse is abuse, and we know what it looks like, and we know what it would feel like for a child suffering that abuse. And I do feel like, it's burn versus a slow boil. If you touch a hot stove, you're burnt instantly. We know that's bad. To avoid a hot stove. But if you're placed in warm water and the temperature is slowly turned up, before you know it, you're in trouble. And it's a slow process. I do feel like this book did an excellent job at depicting the grooming process of this predator. And it does not look like the scary man in the creepy van trying to pass out candy to children. That's not what it looks like. It looks like Vanessa's English teacher telling her she's pretty, making her feel special, making her feel seen, and letting her borrow books, connecting with her over literature, making her feel mature. And the literature part was a pretty important part of this book. Nabokov's novels, Lolita, and then also Pale Fire are featured in this book repeatedly. And obviously there are some parallels between, the storyline in Lolita and what happens here with My Dark Vanessa. She was being conditioned to think this may be okay. Mr. Strain will manipulate Vanessa to the point that she believes this is her first love, that he is her first love, and this is a relationship. Strain also makes Vanessa believe that she has some sort of power over him and that he just can't help himself. This book really shows how confusing that could be for a victim, and how a victim could also feel some sort of guilt for that as well, because they may feel like, well, I sought out this attention and, it felt good. I enjoyed that attention. Something else that this book brings up, which is a delicate topic, but I do feel like it's something that needs to be addressed with victims of abuse, is that there is a physiological response. Vanessa is a 15-year-old girl and she is going through puberty. And so as she is entering this, I don't want to call it a relationship with Mr. Strain, but as she is entering this situation with Mr. Strain, there is an involuntary physiological response that occurs. And that will create a lot of confusion for Vanessa. And you can understand and feel for this child because, she wants to believe. She's young, she's 15, and she wants to believe that she's fallen in love, and she wants to believe that she is special and that someone has seen something in her that sets her apart from everyone else. And I don't think that's something that a lot of people address when they talk to their children about abuse. The abusers are typically people who initially will make you feel special and seem very trustworthy. And so children know that even if you are seeking attention, even if what was happening may have felt good to you, it does not matter. You are still the victim and you didn't do anything to cause this situation. I think that's an important conversation to look at, and it just goes back to the topic of what consent looks like. And obviously, that's a discussion that needs to happen between children and their parents. And I think as a society, we need to have these conversations as well. This book also brings up a lot of questions about agency and power. And obviously the situation with Vanessa, there was an extreme power imbalance, because we have Vanessa, who is this 15-year-old student, and we have this 40-something-year-old English teacher. This book also brought up questions for me about treatment of victims and their stories, because in this book, there's also the storyline of the Me Too movement gaining momentum and people wanting Vanessa to contribute her story and her experience to that movement. And I do feel like the Me Too movement in this story caused Vanessa to lose agency and lose power over her own story. There were people in the book who could not see the trees for their forest. They're looking at the movement and what would be good for the big picture and for the long run and for the success of this social movement, but they've neglected to or flat out refused to consider the repercussions that could have on the individual and what exactly you're doing to that individual when you take away their authority over their own story. Something else that was interesting in this book is that because Vanessa is kind of hypersensitive to all of these references and discussions of, underage girls being in relationships, or what she sees as a relationship with older men and that sort of interplay, you start to notice things that you may not have noticed. So in the book, she talks about her dad singing the song My Sharona in the car. And if you listen to the lyrics of that song, it's inappropriate. And looking at like Britney Spears and how she was portrayed early in her career and how they played up on her sexuality even though she was underage, making her appear like this schoolgirl image and just things that I never really thought about, but because Vanessa was in that situation at that time, she was very sensitive to that, and so she did notice those things. I don't think you can ever understand what someone is going through, but I think this book did a great job of giving some insight into what it would be like to have survived this sort of abuse. And it's a very lonely story. It's a very dark story. I do think it puts a spotlight on some important topics and some important issues. But again, I would warn you that it's not for the faint of heart and deals with some very, very heavy stuff. So it was an excellent book. It was very well done, but probably not for everyone. So I hope everyone is having a great Sunday. I'm sorry if I kind of left you on a downer there, but hopefully my next read will be a little bit more lighthearted. I wanted to read Lolita after finishing this book, but I can't bring myself to do it. I might have to wait a while on that one. But something really exciting happened this week. I did receive a surprise book gift from my friend Summer at Cozy Reading with Quaker Cats. It's Jack Kennedy, Elusive Hero by Chris Matthews, and this is one that I did not already have, so I'm super excited about it. And Summer has agreed to do a buddy read with me on this book in November, and actually Pay at Attention is also going to join that buddy read. And I don't know if you all know this about Pay, but he is also kind of, I don't know if he's obsessed with John F. Kennedy, but he has an interest in John F. Kennedy just like I do. So I can't wait for that, and I will see you guys in the next video. If you have any thoughts on these, please make sure to leave me a comment. Thanks.